Namaskar. Today, in this edition of Right Angle, I will like to bring to all your attention the most important news item, not only in India but also in the rest of the world, of our Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States. I think over the last 2 or 3 days, you must have seen how my colleagues here in Uday, India, have brought out various dimensions of this visit. I am going to highlight a little different angle behind the success of this visit. The growing clouds of Indian diaspora in the United States, and I think the seemingly fear of China as threat to the global peace and stability, in my opinion, explain like nothing else why Modi's just concluded visit to the United States. As you know, as I told, our colleagues have brought out various dimensions of various agreements that have been concluded, including the most important defense item, is very significant in the sense that there are certain factors, there are many certain factors that whenever any prime minister or any head of the government does undertake a visit, really play a very important role, and these factors definitely have played a very important role in the success of this visit, which has been or is being described in the strategic circles of both India and America that it is a defining moment in Indo-US relations.
विलक्षण प्रतिभाओं के धनी लोगों को आपने यहाँ एकत्रित किया है और निमंत्रित किया है, इसके लिए मैं आपका हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं। ये सभी लोग भारत अमेरिका संबंधों की अनेक विशेषताओं का प्रतिनिधित्व करते हैं। हमारी एनर्जी, हमारे डायनेमिज्म और हमारा पोटेंशियल।
In fact, President Joe Biden pointed out during the visit that America's relations with India cannot be compared with his country's ties with China. America values its relations with India higher today because both countries happen to be democracies, according to US President Biden. And let me quote him. He says, "There is a common democratic character in both our countries. Our people, our diversity, our cultures are open, tolerant, robust, and we debate issues," Biden said, "because we believe in the dignity of every citizen." And then importantly, President Biden added that the whole world has a stake in the success of American and Indian democracies, which makes both nations appealing partners, mark the word, appealing partners, and it enables us to expand democratic institutions around the world. So, relations between the United States and India really seem to have transformed considerably since the time when I remember there was an American diplomat posted here in India. He is a very famous writer. His name is Dennis Cox. He wrote a book titled India and the United States, Estranged Democracies. And he had chronicled right from our independence till from 1947 till 1991, the history of bilateral relationship that was marked by more downs than ups. And now, if there are more ups than downs, that is in a large measure due to the increasing profiles of the Indian diaspora in America. And I think I am going to highlight this aspect today, because it is for nothing that during his address to the joint session of the US Congress yesterday, Prime Minister Modi said, and I am quoting him, "The foundation of America was inspired by the vision of a nation of equal people. Throughout your history, you have embraced people from around the world and you have made them equal partners in American dream. There are millions here who have roots in India. Some of them sit proudly in this chamber." That means Modi meant that so many congressmen are from India. I mean they are of Indian origin. And he said, "There is one behind me." He was really pointing out to the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who has made history. Similarly, while welcoming Modi to the White House yesterday, President Biden too highlighted the contributions of Americans of Indian heritage in his administration, including Vice President Kamala Harris. And as he said that I see it in the Indian American diaspora that reflects every part of American life today and remains a bridge between India and America, and this partnership only grows stronger with each generation. We see it with record numbers of Indian Americans serving in the United States Congress. We see it here at the White House, where proud Americans of Indian heritage serve our country every day, including our Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Biden added. And it is important to note that in Biden administration itself, there are now 150 plus Indian Americans who are serving in key positions. So, it is important now. I will like to bring before you some relevant facts regarding this Indian diaspora in the United States. According to the latest available data, Indians represent the second largest US immigrant group after Mexicans, and they are well ahead of the Chinese and Filipinos.
इंडियन अमेरिकन लोगों ने अमेरिका में बहुत लंबी यात्रा तय की है। भारतीय मूल्यों, भारत के लोकतांत्रिक परंपराओं और हमारी संस्कृति के गौरव से भरे हुए इन लोगों को अमेरिका के मेल्टिंग पॉट में निरंतर मान सम्मान मिला है। भारतीय मूल के लोगों ने अमेरिका के समावेशी समाज और अर्थव्यवस्था को और मजबूत बनाने में बहुत बड़ी भूमिका निभाई है।
There are 4.9 million people of Indian origin who reside in the US, and they happen to be the second largest number of the students every year are enrolled in the US higher educational institutions. They share advanced degrees, and in fact, you will be surprised to know that nearly 50% of the Indian immigrant adults hold a graduate degree or a professional degree today, compared to, just imagine, 50% Indians of Indian origin, Indian Americans, or Americans of Indian origin, they hold a degree and professional degree, and that percentage is well above only 13% of the US born adults. That means the real American 13%, and India 50%. But in fact, if you take the number into account, then almost 80% of the Indians in the United States over the school age, they hold at least an undergraduate degree, compared to just 50% of the Chinese Americans and 30% of the total American population. Total American population 30% degree holders, whereas Indians in America 80%. You just can imagine the importance of the Indian diaspora in the US today. And Indian nationals are also the main beneficiaries of the H-1B temporary visas for highly skilled foreign workers, accounting as of last year, I think 2022, as much as 74% of all H-1B visas approved in the last year. And they were followed by Chinese with 12%. Indian 74, Chinese 12%. And nearly 67% of the Indians, they participate in the labor force at the higher rates. And when I am talking labor force, means don't confuse it with the ordinary laborers. Means who are in jobs, government jobs, or big private sector jobs. Then all immigrants and the US born adults, about 72%, sorry, I said that 74, but actually 72% of the Indian immigrants aged 16 and older are in the civilian labor force in 2021, compared to their national percentage of 66 and 62% for the foreign. 66 are the other immigrants community who came from outside, and 62% are the normal, those Americans. So there is also a gap. We, the people of Indian origin also occupy a very high number there. So compared to other groups, Indians are employed in good jobs like management, business, science and arts, and it has been reported that 25 chief executives at the top 500 companies of the United States today are of Indian descent, and up from 11 a decade ago. That means 10 years back 11, now 25%. And these include whom? What are the companies? Abbott, then your IBM, Alphabet, Google's, Microsoft. And importantly, the deans at 3 of the 5 leading business schools in the United States, including the Harvard Business School, are of Indian origin. And as you know, the new head of the World Bank, Uday, who had run MasterCard for more than a decade, was born and educated here in India before he immigrated to US. It is no wonder then that Indians are the highest earning migrant group in America, and this is important for you people to note that the average Indian migrant family in the US, that household income is 100. I'm talking of the average. I mean, it will vary. It may be much more, 300, 400, 500, more than 1,000. But then average annual income of these Indian Americans there in the United States is $150,000 per year, and that is the double of the national average. That means an average American family earns $75,000 a year, whereas an Indian American 150, just the double. And they are well ahead of the Chinese migrants, whose median household income is around $95,000 per year. And importantly, it has been found out that most of the Indian immigrants who have done extremely well as highly paid professionals in the US happen to be the cream of the students here in India who studied science, engineering, medical and business management before immigrating to America. And this trend has been particularly noticeable since the late 1990s. Here, what has happened that, this migration to the United States has happened through various, phases. Even during our independence, struggle in the early 20s, 30s, many people had, gone as the agricultural laborers. That Gaddar party also played a very important role. I mean, that was formed in America in the independence, movement. And then 65, some people, went from Gujarat and Punjab, basically. Then South Indians went, but actually they were not that well-to-do who were migrating then. That they became very big persons after immigrating is something different matter. But the new trend that I told, the new trends in the late 1990s, the people who are immigrating to India, our cream of the students who really do all these things, basic degree education here, and they do migrate and they go for higher studies, and then they do wonders. In other words, the majority of Indians who come to the United States today are relatively from the well-to-do families and well educated. They are not poor, which is the case with the majority of the other immigrants to the United States. If one looks at the 20% of the researchers in artificial intelligence, for instance, which is the key thing now, happening everywhere, like IT, it is now ahead of this or above or beyond this IT age, everybody talks about it. Then, 20% of these people who are now occupying important positions there happen to be the Indians, and out of that 8% of them, they really did their first degree in India. So what all this means is that these Indian Americans having the best professional jobs form a huge constituency for India, which no American government or business can ignore. It is all the more so when Modi, notwithstanding what his critics may say, has nurtured this constituency in every important country, and particularly in the United States, in terms of what he says, 3 C's, capital C's. First C means connect with India. Then second C, celebrate with India's cultural heritage. And third, contribute to the development of your motherland or homeland. Here I'll like to make a small point. When our country became independent, Jawaharlal Nehru became the Prime Minister. His suggestion was that those people particularly those of the Indian origin people who have decided to stay in other countries, they should sever all their connections with India. They should be good citizens of the countries where they are residing. I think what Modi did, actually this trend started when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the Prime Minister. They totally reversed this government's stand, that these days they have that Pravasi Divas and reconnecting with Indian diaspora, and this trend got the most important push by Modi, and as a result what is happening, they have now become India's strategic asset, if I may use that term. They have become strategic asset because of their exercising influence with the governments in their respective countries for better ties with India, or becoming investor in India's developmental activities. It is true that diaspora is not monolithic, and affluent, very strident voices from a section of it against Modi government have emerged. Like we saw, their press conferences, some sections who say that India has become a totalitarian fascist country, Modi is Hitler. But overall their number is very minor. A survey not long ago showed that the majority in the diaspora, they love Modi and they are deeply committed to India and its causes. However, it is now worth pondering over why in the US, which is essentially a nation of immigrants, as you know, as a nation, wave of immigrants, they went from 16th, 17th century onwards. First the Brits went, then the other Europeans, Italians. So US is actually a country of immigrants. But then why is it that some diasporas succeed better than others in successfully influencing American foreign policy? And here, according to an American professor, his name is John Newhouse, he specializes in foreign lobbies in the United States, that Indian Americans are as effective as American Jews in lobbying, or that means in fighting for influencing the American policymakers for their mother country, which is India. According to him, India's US-based lobby is the only lobby in Washington that is likely to acquire the strength of the Israeli lobby, because the Indian Americans, this lobby rely on a very strong network of law and public relation firms and are supported by a large, as I told you, nearly 4.9 million people now in the US, and they all want to improve relations with India. And many of, as again I had pointed out, that many of these people are so well educated and so financially successful that they are bound to really be in a position to convince the US policymakers towards India. I mean, convincing the US policymakers to take US closer towards India, or bringing the two countries closer together. And one important feature of this growing clout of the Indian Americans is because of their proximity with the people who really matter in Washington, that means the political circles. Because many of the children of these prosperous and highly influential Indians, they work with senators and the congresspersons in the Capitol Hill as the interns and staff members. As Professor Devesh Kapoor of Johns Hopkins University, he himself is an Indian American, he says, Capitol Hill is crammed with staff and interns of Indian American heritage. They also appear to be overrepresented in academia, the media, and other influential posts. Besides, like the American Jews, Indian Americans are now very active participants in American politics as donors, as voters, or as candidates. As I said that Kamala Harris is of Indian origin and is the vice president, and even other countries, Mr. Sunak now is the British prime minister. These things were unthinkable, say 15 or 20 years ago. But you see, the success of the Indian diaspora is because, why? Because there are high levels of education, English language proficiency, and roots in India, a country with its long democratic tradition, all help their ever increasing political participation. In fact, recently there was a study by the Cambridge University, and that study argues that two factors increase the likelihood of any diaspora mobilization. One, a community's experience with democratic governance and conflict in country of origin. So these conditions, that means the democratic roots of their mother country, make it more likely that these people will be successful political entrepreneurs or successful lobbyists to really have an impact on the decision makers of the country of their residence like US, and they serve as a catalyst for top down mobilization. So viewed thus, Indian Americans have a strong advantage over other immigrants like Chinese Americans because of their democratic roots in India and their mastery over English, a British colonial legacy that they share with Americans, and it really helps. And the last but not least, Indian diaspora's influence on Washington, drawing closer to Delhi than Beijing, is also facilitated by the fact that there is an increasing realization both in India and the United States that China is our common adversary. A recent Gallup survey, that is a public opinion firm, it says that a record low of 15% of Americans view China favorably. That means 85% of the Americans today, they do not like China. But in contrast, 77% of them rate India very positively. This perhaps explains why there is a strong bipartisan support of India in the US. And the rationale here is that though India is strictly not an ally of United States, military ally like say Britain is, France is, Germany is, as members of NATO, or for that matter bilateral ally like Japan, South Korea, Australia, but still the Americans think India will play a better role in containing China's rising power than say a France or a Germany or even a Japan, given the intensity and range of their respective economic links with Beijing. Because these countries, they have such high economic dependence, or let's put it interdependence, that it is doubtful that suppose tomorrow a conflict situation arises between the US and China, whether they will really come behind the US and openly will go against China. That is doubtful. So on the other hand, if any country in this part, that is which we call the Indo-Pacific region, really shares this Chinese fear, and we will do everything possible to contain this growing Chinese influence, and here India and the United States actually are natural allies. So this is in my considered view, the real factor that really has played the most important role in making this Modi's visit to the United States a spectacular success. Thank you.